I have officially left the US. I moved to Europe. I'm not going to share where at this time, but I've gotten a few questions about what prompted this decision, and today let's talk about it. So, most of you know that I am originally European. I was born in Romania and raised there for the first few years of my life, and then I've kind of lived all over ever since. The first thing you've got to understand is that I've wanted to return to Europe pretty much ever since I got to the US. It wasn't really my choice to come to the US, of course. At that age, it was my parents' choice, what they thought was the best option for our family. And unfortunately, it did mean that I experienced some attachment ruptures with some of those primary caregivers who raised me in the first few years of my life. That is hard on a young child. And when I got to the US, I can't really say that I ever felt I fully fit in or was accepted by any social group. When I first arrived, when I was itty bitty, I obviously didn't speak any English. I had trouble expressing myself, and to be in a new foreign country, to not be able to express yourself, that was scary as a kid. Obviously, I got over it. I picked up English pretty quickly, but it's not the most positive first impression. And even once I did master English, and even once my English actually superseded my Romanian language skills, I still never quite felt like I fit in. You know, it might sound like something very small, but even as a little girl, I remember, for instance, I wanted to be like a girly girl. I wanted to wear dresses, I wanted to have long hair, all this stuff. It felt very different from what was the norm among American kids. The popular kids at my school, at least until like middle school, were usually more like tomboys. They had different hobbies, different interests. I just didn't feel quite as connected to them. Though I did form some wonderful friendships, like I said, I never quite felt like I belonged into a social group. And that feeling like you don't quite belong somewhere can be very hard because you carry it everywhere you go. Everywhere you go, you constantly feel like there isn't a home base for me. There isn't someplace where I truly belong. As I got older, the discrepancy between my values and common American values, not to paint with one very broad brushstroke, became more and more pronounced. Some of the things that I value include savoring life, vacationing often, not putting somebody else's company as my top priority. For instance, in grad school, I had a lot of difficulties with the fact that I didn't have enough vacation time to go visit my family in Romania. That was very difficult for me. But now that we're in Europe, pretty much everywhere that we want to travel is in Europe. There are still some places where I want to travel outside of Europe, but to tell you the truth right now, my priority is more local. So a few hours by plane or train really is so much simpler for us than having to get into a cross-Atlantic flight that takes upwards of 12 hours to reach our destination. Some other values that are very central to me are history and beauty and high quality of life. Being someplace that doesn't have a very rich history like the US, that is only like a few hundred years old, and the history before that is kind of unknown to us because of the unfortunate reality of what happened to indigenous culture, it made me feel a little bit not rooted. When I'm in Europe and I see old homes, old architecture, old culture, that feels very aligned with who I am as a person. I like to know that the places where I'm walking, people have walked hundreds and thousands of years before, and I can see the relics of what they have created, and I can feel their legacy, and I can feel almost like the spirit of a place. I just didn't feel that in the US. In Seattle, for instance, Seattle is maybe like 200 years old. Still very much in its infancy, quite underdeveloped. The architecture to me was so unappealing. So I realize this might sound like something silly to you, but you can't really say that another person's values are silly. History and beauty are important to me, and being somewhere that doesn't have those things is difficult. Moving on to more like sociopolitical values, I have noticed for years at this point, for maybe like a decade, that the US is very rife with political polarization and radicalization. And yes, this is the case in many places in Europe as well. I think it's kind of a global phenomenon that we're noticing. But the thing about the US is that the largely two-party system very much promotes this political polarization. The fact that there are only really two parties that people can vote for and independents that very much get the shit end of the stick means that people put themselves in one of two boxes for the most part. They say, this is my box, this is my in-group, and this is the out-group. This is them over there who are in many ways villains compared to me, and I don't stand for that. When I would go back and visit Romania, for instance, and I would tell my cousin about some of these experiences, he would say to me, but how can this be the case? How can it be that, for instance, abortion rights are being taken back when all I hear from the US is how crazy the woke culture is getting? And I had to explain to him, it's both. There's a faction of American society that is getting very radically left, and there's a faction of American society that's becoming very radically to the right. And those two at some point are going to have a very significant friction that honestly scares me. It scares me in terms of what the future is going to look like, because I don't see any way that people can come together until they acknowledge that such a black and white view of politics is not healthy. And I don't think that people generally realize that until they reach rock bottom. Something else about the sociopolitical situation in the US is that there's just a ton of victim culture right now. Victimhood. Everybody wants to see themselves as a victim because of identities that they hold, or identities that sometimes they've concocted for themselves, like through self-diagnosis. And I used to be very far on the left. I used to be all into social justice and things like that until I was in an environment that was so extreme that it honestly pushed me away from that. And it made me realize how radical those things can go. And I just do not like the type of self-victimized external locus of control culture that particularly young people of my generation, have in the US. And so that at least is a lot better in Europe. There is still a little bit of it, but it's a lot less than you would expect. And another value that, again, might sound silly to you, but has always been important to me. I like to dress up. I like to surround myself with beauty of all kinds, whether it's putting on a nice perfume, putting on clothes that I feel express who I am, doing my hair, my makeup, all of that stuff, decorating my home. I like to be surrounded by beauty, right? In the US, there's not as much of a focus on being presentable when you are in public spaces. And I don't judge people who go out wearing pajamas or whatever, but I do find that it's not very inspiring to me. When I am surrounded by people, I like to feel inspired by what they're wearing, by how they're portraying themselves, how they're expressing themselves. I like to learn from other people, steal inspiration from them and use it to express myself. I don't really want to live in a place where it is acceptable to go out in pajamas. And in Europe, it's very much not. In Europe, I feel like there is a little bit of social pressure to put my best face forward, put a little bit of makeup on when I go to the supermarket. I like that. You might not, and again, I don't judge you if you don't view things this way, but that is just personally the kind of setting that I like to be in. Another reason why we moved is that we just want a better place to raise our future kids. So this means better food quality in terms of healthier and tastier. The difference in the food quality blows my mind. I've only been here for like 3-4 days at this point, and it is night and day compared to the US, especially the fruits and vegetables, and the dairy, and the meat. Well, everything. Also, Europe as a whole has a better healthcare system, whereas in the US, you pay a lot for insurance that doesn't even cover most of what you need. As more affordable school care. My husband and I, when we weren't sure whether we were going to move yet, we were planning on putting aside hundreds of thousands of dollars for our future children's universities. And now, although we still have that plan to have those funds for them in the future, the reality is that most of those funds are probably not going to go to their university. They're probably going to use them once they're adults, because university just doesn't cost that much in Europe. We also wanted a place with more community. We had a really hard time finding a social group in Seattle, and part of that was that it wasn't really a priority for us. Part of that was that there's something called the Seattle Freeze, where people just aren't super friendly with each other, aren't really proactive about hanging out. In Europe, it's just a lot more community-based, and it's a lot more common to go out with friends and see family throughout the week rather than just on the weekends. So that's something that was appealing to us. We wanted a place with less ideological extremism for where our kids are going to be taught. I personally value that Europe has stricter legislation around toxins and carcinogens, because I think it's very dubious that the US is sometimes loose in their restrictions about those things for just economic reasons. Like for years, I would microwave meals that were wrapped in plastic, and no one ever told me that that was a carcinogen. I mean, that cannot be good to accumulate those forever plastics in your body for decades. And of course, Europe still has some of that, but it's a lot better. Having our kids go to school somewhere where there aren't school shootings, at least to the extent that there is in the US, that's a huge perk as well. I can't say that it's ever something I really worried about in the US because, well, I don't have kids yet, but I never really thought that something like that would happen to my future kids. However, definitely much higher than it should be. Another reason why we wanted to move was to be closer to friends and family. Now, both sets of our parents still live in the US. However, everyone except my parents in my family lives in Romania, and a lot of our friends live in Europe, whether it be friends that were European and moved back or friends that were actually American and moved to Europe. And a lot of those friends would never go back, honestly. They're quite happy and they have very different testimonials of their quality of life than our friends who stayed in America. So even if we don't build like a super tight-knit community where we live, because let's say there's xenophobia and we're not fully accepted here either, we still have a lot of friends and family that we can see every month and we can still have those moments of connection. And it's a lot easier to get from one country to the next to see each other than it is to get around the US. I mean, the cost of going from Canada to certain parts of Europe is actually cheaper than getting from California to Washington state. Mind blowing. Another factor that kind of pushed us out of at least Washington state is the cost of living in the West Coast. We would never be able to afford a home there. Groceries for two people cost over $300 a week. And we would try to plan out our meals, we would try to be mindful of what we were buying, and still it was never less than $300 a week to get groceries. Our rent was almost $4,000 for 2 rooms. It wasn't anything fancy, and it honestly was one of the cheapest places that we found for what we were looking for in Seattle. So even though both of us brought decent income, nothing crazy, there was just no way for us to have enough money for a stable home and future security and starting a family. Although I loved the natural beauty of Washington state, we just couldn't realistically live there long term. And something else is that we thought about how if we don't leave now, we probably never will. Already, I have so much grief over the time that I've lost that I could have spent in Europe. I wanted to move in Europe even for grad school. I wanted to be in Europe 6 years ago. And you know what's interesting is the night before we left, I had a dream that basically the gist of the dream was, you should have left sooner. Why did you delay? You should have left long before today. Because there are family members that I don't want to waste any more time with, because I was worried about the direction I saw the US going in, and because there was nothing really keeping us there. We don't have kids yet, we don't have a home yet. Now is the perfect time for us to go and build our lives elsewhere. Otherwise, our next opportunity probably would have been retirement. And I don't want to wait 30 years to make my dreams come true. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to make it seem like the US has only negatives and Europe is this idyllic place. That's very much not the case. Personally, for us, staying in the US was not the right fit for the reasons I just mentioned. Because I have dual citizenship and we both work remotely, we had an incredible opportunity to make our dreams come true. So I look forward to taking you along with me on this journey. Although, like I said, I won't be sharing where exactly I live. You'll definitely see some of my travels around Europe, and you'll see my own self-development journey along this new change, because it is very scary. It's uncomfortable to push myself outside my comfort zone like this. So I'm sure that it's going to be a really big growth opportunity that will reflect in the type of videos I make on YouTube. I want to hear your thoughts, so let me know in the comments what you thought about what I said in this video, and I'll see you soon.